Thank you. I'll take that as a cue that we can begin. Good afternoon. I'm Adrian Ivachev, Professor of Environmental Studies here at UVM, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you all to a wonderful event featuring someone who many of us consider to be something of an elder within the environmental community in Vermont. And I say that not only because of his name or because he's Professor Emeritus from Middlebury College, but because of the long-standing work he has done, particularly the writing he has done on environmental themes as a scholar of environmental literature, nature writing as a writer himself, and that's John Elder. I'll let my co-conspirator in organizing this, and that's Professor Maria Woolson from Romance Languages and Linguistics, introduce John Elder. But I just wanted to mention that this is part of a series that is building through the course of this year of events and talks in the environmental humanities and eco-arts. And if you're interested in learning more about what's coming up, and particularly next semester, we'll have a series of speakers coming. Look me up and email me and I will get you on a mailing list for that. So this event is happening thanks to, first of all, Romance Languages and Linguistics, the Department of Romance Languages and Linguistics, and especially Sasha Woolson, Professor Maria Woolson, who was instrumental in getting John Elder to come here. Secondly, the Rubenstein School, which is supporting the talk and my capacity to help bring people to UVM. Thirdly, the Environmental Program and Nate Sanders, its director. And fourthly, the Honors College. They have all made it possible for John Elder to be here. And without taking up any more of your time, I want to introduce Professor Maria Woolson to come and introduce our speaker for today.
So thank you all for coming again. And I'm going to read a little bit, but it is truly an honor to welcome John Elder, Professor Emeritus of Middlebury College and the Brettliff School of English, to the University of Vermont. Meeting John and getting to know his work and his generous nature has been a true privilege for me, and I hope that you enjoy his talk as much as I've enjoyed his work in the past couple of decades. An environmental scholar, writer, and literary critic, he taught English and environmental studies at Middlebury and the Brettliff School of English until his retirement in 2010. 3 of his books, and hopefully they're showing up on the screen, Reading the Mountains of Home, The Frog Run, Works and Wilderness in the Vermont Woods, and Pilgrimage to Vallombrosa, form a sequence unified by a combination of literary discussion, description of the Vermont landscape, and memoir. Earlier titles include, and I hope that's what's showing, Imaging the Earth, Poetry and Visions of Nature, Family of Earth and Sky, Indigenous Tales of Nature from Around the World, and his most recent book, Picking Up the Flute. Is it on there? Or? Can't quite. Okay. Picking Up the Flute, that came out in 2016, where he relates his immersion in Ireland's traditional music following retirement, within the broader context of marriage, teaching, and holiness. He's also co-editor with Robert Finch of the Norton Book of Nature's Writing. John and his wife Rita live in Bristol and operate a sugar bush in the nearby hills of Starksboro with the families of his 2 sons. They're active in such statewide environmental organizations as the Vermont Land Trust and the Vermont Family Forest. So without further comments, I would like to welcome John to the stage, and I'll leave you with him. So this is the button.
Great, thank you. Thanks to Adrian and to Sasha for supporting this talk. Thanks to Sasha for doing so many generous and thoughtful arrangements as we put this talk together. It's really nice to be here today. Thank you for coming on this lovely day. And I'm also very happy to be in this really beautiful room again. What I'd like to do today is share with you some reflections about the language we use. Like this? Is it better? I'd like to share some reflections about the language we use in talking about both the natural environment and this moment of environmental challenge, because in fact, am I okay? Aren't you loud? Okay. In fact, this language is so volatile. We keep coming up with terms to talk about what we think, what we're experiencing, and then the terms collapse under our feet. So that's really what I'd like to talk about. I'm going to frame some general observations about environmental language in the concept of echotones from the science of ecology, and then I'm going to develop the idea further through an extended reading of Gary Snyders' poem For the Children. I'll especially focus, excuse me, on the last 3 lines of that poem, "Stay together, learn the flowers, go light," which is where my title comes from. One of the fun things for me about teaching with scientists, as I've often done, is that I got to learn stuff. I got to follow them around and walk around in ponds with hip boots on, and I got to learn the difference between exponential curves and logarithmic curves, and I think I've got that straight finally. And I also got exposed to the term echotones. Excuse me. An echotone is what ecologists call the zone that lies between 2 more or less distinct ecosystems. It's also called an edge. And such boundary zones have what ecologists call edge effect. This means especially rich biotic character. For one thing, if you're lying between 2 constituent echotones, you have some species from each of them, as well as some that are unique to the ecotone itself. In addition, there's typically a biotic mass that's beyond what you'd normally expect in a zone of that area. So it's a really nutritious environment for any organism to colonize. The other thing about an ecotone, though, is edges move. One of the examples of an ecotone would be the rocky shore of Maine, Rachel Carson's favorite environment. Tidally, twice a day, it reverses. It goes from terrestrial to marine and back again. Another example might be a wetland or marsh, where there's seeping and draining more or less constantly, or the pasture of an abandoned Vermont hill farm, where woods are creeping in and taking over. So edges move, and what that means is that though a critter might venture into an ecotone looking for abundance, that critter might well end up being some other critter's lunch who's just come in from the other side of the ecotone, because you never know who you're going to meet there. It's not a kind of established cast of characters, and it's always moving. So those are the 2 things about ecotones I wanted to establish at the beginning. They are rich and precarious environments. And I think that that's a pretty good analogy for our historical moment and for our conversation about the environment. The historical moment I'm referring to is basically the period since World War II, when there was an explosion of technology, a multiplication of our uses of fossil fuels, and also a kind of implosion of certain qualities of environmental health as habitats and species both faced the possibility of extinction. So we've been trying to come up with new language that would help us think about this new world, that would help us to inhabit the ecosystem we're in, to make the most of its richness, and to move forward. Now, you know, if you just described our historical ecotone in the terms I've described it now, you'd think that it was mostly precarious. But the richness of it, which I think is registered by language, is that this is an opportunity to think new thoughts, to revise our expectations. When I used to teach writing, I was always telling my students, and now that I continue to write, I'm always telling myself, when I encounter a gap in the middle of something I've written, or they encounter one in things they've written, that looks like a failure, a train wreck, a falling apart, but it's also the place where that piece of writing wants to be its strongest. Because the only way to get across that gap is to go deeper, to find a place to put down the footings for the bridge to go across. Without that gap, you could finish in a superficial way. With it, you might finish more profoundly. And I think that that's the kind of world we're living in now. We have an opportunity to rethink things, to revisit our premises, and to move toward a healthier basis for living with what the philosopher and nature writer David Abram has called the more than human world. So let me begin by thinking a little bit about why our language is so volatile, some examples of it. One term that's been used often in the environmental discourse is sustainable growth. It was used so often in thinking about policy issues until people noticed that there was a kind of oxymoron built into it. Any human being who never stopped growing would be defined as having a hyperthyroid condition and probably put on bed rest as having reached the point where it was hard to move around with such bulk. But in fact, our philosophers, our economists and policy people continue to evaluate political and economic policy by the comparison of who seems likely to produce the most growth. We need to find a way to think about economy and other policies that aren't premised on endless growth. We need a new set of concerns. So sustainable growth, I think, has collapsed under our feet. The word sense of place, which I've used often, I've had it in the title of more than one course I've taught, has some similar problems. There's a kind of passive receptivity in it. There's a place, and there's our impression of it from standing far enough away to look at it. It's not active, energetic, or engaged. In short, it's come to seem a buzzword. The word wilderness, which has been at the absolute center of environmental thinking since John Muir until maybe 2 decades ago, also has been critiqued. People like William Cronin has begun to see it as insufficiently informed by the deep history of humanity. A native writer like Leslie Marmon Silko looks at it as a view of unroaded places that separates wilderness from culture in a way that native cultures have never done. And finally, the word environmental has come in for increasing criticism. Wendell Berry has a wonderful essay. Of course, he can do curmudgeonly like nobody, but he wrote an essay about the word environmental. And his point is environment, environmental, and environmentalism imply what is around us, environ, what's all around us. We're in the middle, we're separate, we're looking around, maybe beginning to circle and look, but nonetheless not connected. So that's where I start, looking at these inadequate terms and asking what could we do that was a little more solid, at least in the short run. And I do have a term to propose for you and that I'll develop. I hope that it doesn't collapse under my feet before the end of the talk. I'm hoping it'll get me at least that far. What we want is to move beyond abstraction and beyond pure rationality to something that also includes concrete involvement and personal dedication. In those regards, 2 of the words in my subtitle, sustainable and community, I think both have their problems as well. In our day and age, community immediately pops up the word virtual. We think of communities have always been able to be expressed as affinity groups, but online you can live and dwell and talk in a community of people who more or less share all of your ideas, while none of them may actually live in your neighborhood. Sustainability, I think, is another word that finally isn't strong enough. Sustainable. What it implies for me is a kind of holding action. Hold on to what we've got. Dig in, make it last. Whereas what we really may need in order to move toward an ethos of connection and commitment is reversal of many of our current policies. We might need to rethink things more fully. So this brings me to the word I'd like to propose, explain, and then explore in the context of Gary Snyders' poem for the children. The word is affiliation. What I like about that word is that it's active. We can affiliate. It comes from the Latin verb affiliare, which comes from two segments. Ad, means to or at. to move towards something, and filius or filia are the Latin words for son or daughter. So to ad filiare is to adopt, as in a child, or to be adopted into a family. And this familial, active, emotional, committed, and satisfying set of words seems to me very promising for our way of thinking about living in a place on earth and living within the human and more than human possibilities. Once we form a family, we think differently about what it means to be in community than we would in a simply economic context. The economists classically would imagine social interactions by economic models as each individual seeking relative advantage. But families don't work that way. If they did, the smallest person at the table would never eat. You know, we have commitment to each other. We help each other carry through the world. So in terms of explaining further my sense of what it means not only to affiliate with a place and with our neighbors in that place, but also to do so at a moment of ecological crisis and under a sky shadowed by climate change, that's where I'd like to move into the Gary Snyder poem, For the Children, to help explain my sense of the term in that context. Now, Sasha, you tell me when the poem comes up. The poem is up. Okay, I'm going to read this poem right now, and then I will I'll look at it piece by piece. Snyder's poem, Turtle Island, was published in 1974 in a book called, so For the Children was published in 74 in the book entitled Turtle Island. So it's interesting, this is far before climate change was a big part of the public conversation. Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, which really introduced climate change to a worldwide audience, didn't get published till 1989. At the same time, even given this timing, it's a poem that speaks with dramatic pertinence and directness to our current situation, a situation in which so many living systems are under threat. And it's one that I think brings out some implications for this affiliation, this familial model. There's pressure placed on our affiliation today because of these global ecological challenges, but I think they can actually make our sense of being connected with the earth and with each other stronger. You know, if your family is endangered in a time of war, if someone you love is ill, you don't love them less. You know, you love them more. And I think that that's the invitation of such a moment for us. So let me read this poem to you and then share with you some of my responses. The rising hills, the slopes of statistics lie before us. The steep climb of everything going up, as we all go down. In the next century and the one beyond that, they say, are valleys, pastures. We can meet there in peace if we make it. To climb these coming crests, one word to you and your children, stay together, learn the flowers, go light. Well, the first thing to say, I would like to say, in reference to that first little segment of this poem, is that those lines, the rising hills, the slopes of statistics, when I first read those two lines, I thought, it's a graph, the slope of statistics, and a particular kind of graph, too. It's one that moves along the horizontal axis until it comes to a kind of elbow, at which point it quickly curves up and aspires to the purely vertical. This is the graph of our time. Among other things, that give you a graph? Oh, good. See, everybody in this room can see these screens but me. So I was hoping it gave you a graph. Among other things, it's the graph of human population growth. This is called an exponential curve, one that crosses a certain line and begins to come up and parallel a kind of implicit vertical called the asymptote that it approaches, but never exceeds. And as you can see in this graph, the rate of population growth has been tremendous over the last half century. One thing I've often heard, should pull out my calculator and try it, but is that most of the people, most of the Homo sapiens who've ever lived are alive today. Within the 21st century, it's going to probably move up over 11 billion people, according to the latest UN reports, one that was issued just a couple of months ago. Well, this is a daunting curve. It seems to be a kind of will to a kind of velocity that will leave the atmosphere, that will take off, will never need to stop. And it's a graph that also might be used, if you had the right scales, to describe use of carbon, of fossil fuels, deposition of carbon in the atmosphere, extinction of species and habitat destruction, a kind of accelerating, ever accelerating relative to its previous velocity development that is frightening, terrifying. As Gary Snyder writes, the steep climb of everything going up, as we all go down. How do we survive this reality? There's a quality of the inexorable to this vertical momentum, but on the other hand, there's a sense that at some point it has to curve back down around, and this is where the logarithmic, as I understand it, correction of the exponential comes into effect. The other axis develops its pull. One way to talk about this is Earth is not infinite. It has a carrying capacity. We can't go up forever. At some point, in some context, it has to come back down. It's common to talk about our current society as having a fossil fuel addiction. And it's interesting thinking about it in that context. If you had a young wastrel who was, say, an alcoholic and squandering a fortune on booze, really there are just three outcomes you could imagine. One is that person might just drink up his or her inheritance and go bust. Another might be that he or she would die of liver poisoning. And a third might be that young heir might just sober up. One way or the other, though, it can't go on forever. There's a kind of carrying limit, a capacity which can't be exceeded. And that takes us to the next of the lines in the sections in Snyder's poem. In the next century, or the one beyond, that, they say, are valleys, pastures. We can meet there in peace if we make it. It's amazing how this poem in 1974 has aligned with current thinking about human population. Between now and, I can't see the graph, but by 2100, say, 2100, we're probably going to come out at around 11.2 billion. But already the rates of fertility in every country in the world are dropping. In all of Western Europe and in Japan, they're already way below replacement levels. The only thing that will keep them from dwindling dramatically would be to allow significant immigration, which is something that's obviously an issue around the world. In North America and in China, both of those countries are just about at equilibrium now in terms of replacement after the really draconian population policies in China, but both of them will begin to tail right off in the next several decades unless there is very significant immigration. On the other hand, many of the poorest countries in the world, economically speaking, are still having population explosions. India will pass China as the most populous country in the world within the next couple of decades and will probably begin to approach 2 billion. And a number of other countries like those in the northeast quadrant of Africa have population explosions. So we're looking at a coming century in which the poorest people will have the fastest population growth and the richest countries will have increasingly graying populations. It's a recipe for a wild roller coaster ride. It will be a turbulent time. But the question is, how can we both work together as people to share what we have in a fair approach to the world's resources, and also work to help protect the vitality and the diversity of the more than human world. The biologist E.O. Wilson, perhaps the most eminent organismal biologist alive, speaks about this 21st century as the bottleneck. And by that he means we have a lot of things that have to go through a narrow little passage if we want them to come out on the other side and have a world that's still filled with plenitude and beauty and health. Snyder says, in the next century or the one beyond that are valleys, pastures. The current thinking in international population studies is that the 22nd century may be where the overall curve of human growth begins to bend back down. That there may be places where we move past the bottleneck, there are fewer of us, we found a way to use less fossil fuels, and we can rethink the premises that got us into this trouble in the first place. There are valleys, pastures. We can meet there in peace if we make it. It's very interesting, this image from Snyder. And of course, if you've read much Snyder, you know he's fascinated with East Asian culture. He wrote a whole book about a Chinese landscape painting. The book is called Mountains and Rivers Without End. But I wanted to bring up another painting to show you that I think speaks even more to this poem. Is that a picture of a painting now? Oh, good. This is all working so well now, and I'm relieved. But this is a painting by a Chinese artist named Gong Wang. He's a 14th century painter. It's a detail from a landscape scroll called Dwelling in the Fuchun Mountains. And it's characteristic of a certain kind of Chinese ink painting where you have these incredibly precipitous mountains. People used to look at them and think the artists are really exaggerating the mountainous of that, until photographs from southern China began to circulate in wider patterns of circulation, and we saw that's what the mountains in southern China look like. They have this incredible shape. But you go up, we've been climbing that slope, that steep slope, and then we come down, because you can't go up forever. You come down, and on the other side are valleys, pastures, where we can meet in peace. One of the things about the Chinese landscape painters is they tend to put little human figures, not in the foreground the way Western landscape paintings might, but little human figures, little buildings in the midst of dramatic mountain scenery. That in itself is a kind of implication that one way to have a sustainable sense of affiliation is to find a small enough scale to recognize each other and to remember that something is much bigger than us. They say, if we can make it, that we might be able to meet in peace after we move through this bottleneck, if we begin thinking about how to do it now. I think that Snyder's poem is not a sentimental one. It's not a glossed over vision. As I said before, I think that the 21st century will be a wild ride. How could it not be? But it's one where we can begin to look toward what comes next. A concept that Snyder brings into his writing constantly that's been so helpful for me is that of the main flow. There's a kind of tautology behind it. He's affected by ancient Chinese thinking about Taoism, that water settles down, it occupies the low ground, non-assertiveness is the way in which we can move toward balance. But there's a tautology that is oddly comforting for me, which is nothing that is not sustainable will be sustained. Who could argue with that? We can't live in the current consumptive mode that we live in now. And we might not get to see that kind of balance reattained, but we can align ourselves now in our relationship to fossil fuels, to transportation, to food, with what needs to be the balance found by our society in a larger sense. Gary Snyder, in addition to being influenced by East Asian thought, was strongly influenced by Native American thought, and he has a timeline that's not typical of contemporary American writers. I've heard him say in lectures and talks, you know, I don't think that things are going to get much better in the next 50 or 100 years. But I think in 2 or 3 centuries, we might really begin to see some improvement. This is not a very American point of view. You know, it's not looking at the next election cycle, but it's by that same token, it's encouraging. We can do that. We can do that now. Well, then the last third of the poem has the poet turn toward giving us direct advice. to climb these coming crests. One word to you and your children: stay together, learn the flowers, go light. I'm going to spend a lot of time in those, much of the time remaining on those last three lines, because they're so pithy, they're so reverberant, and they have that kind of compression of a haiku. We can carry them with us. Stay together. I referred before to a family in a time of travail. Like many of us, I'm sure, I just can't get out of my mind the pictures of those little families in the Syrian refugee camps, you know, with the kids sitting in their parents' laps, looking around them in this tent city, trying to figure out where they are, where they've come from, where they go next, clinging to each other. I think that disaster is clarifying. It brings out the preciousness of our group. Staying together is the ultimate goal at such a time. I think this is resonant for families. It also has something to do with social structures. Snyder is extremely interested in the Paleolithic times, the times of the hunter-gatherers who moved across southern Europe in the post-glacial era, hunting reindeer and making the incredible spiritual paintings in the caves at places like Lascaux and Peshmeral that are such marvels of love for the animals and love for the Great Mother. That bleak moment was a magnifier, and staying together at a time when we're so stressed by the challenges we face today, in some ways, is the ultimate goal. It also speaks to our challenges, obviously, around the world, but in this country. The way in which, at times of stress, it's so easy to divide into oppositional tribes, to be polarized and to think of our goals in relation to intertribal victory. Finally, though, I think what we need to do is identify with a group that we can take in, whose eyes we can meet, to find a sense of renewed community that's local and, like in the hunter-gatherer bands, multi-generational as we move along together. The richest of those last three lines for me is learn the flowers. This is the most memorable, the most reverberant of all of them for me, and I'd like to linger on it for a second. I was out in Central Oregon last week giving a talk, and I read a book from the Warm Springs Indian Reservation, which was right beside where I was speaking in Bend. It's called Biography of a Place by a man named Martin Winch, and it talks about the Warm Springs Reservation has three tribes who live on it. It's a vast, beautiful, dramatic place in the high desert, some space between plants out there. And the author wrote about traveling